talked about how policy is non-linear. Think about it like Bitcoin's price. It's kind of like a gradually then suddenly thing.
The president's words have weight, and these moves could trigger responses by other countries and other national leaders that potentially can go quicker than our democratic process can. And so all of those changes could be precipitated by, not much. This next 6 to 12 months, I think, will be very critical to the future of Bitcoin in America.
All right, welcome everybody. We are here with Matt Pines, Executive Director at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where he oversees operational execution, special programs, and strategic engagement. Matt has 13 years of experience helping the government and private sector address pressing security challenges. We're here with Matt today to touch a little bit on what's going on Tuesday, which is going to be the Bitcoin Policy Institute's Bitcoin for America programming, or an event that they're hosting in Washington, D.C. But before we get into that, let me pass the mic over to you, Matt. Would you mind just introducing yourself a bit more for the audience?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, recently joined BPI full time as executive director. I've been supporting them since their founding by Grant McCarty and David Zell as a national security fellow. And so my background has been more in helping the government assess, worst case scenarios and to sort of think around these different corners, asking these sort of what if questions, technology disruption, geopolitical change. And so I started looking at Bitcoin through that lens several years ago. And then now it's become a strategic question that I think requires my full-time engagement. And so I am really excited to now jump in to help lead BPI as both the organization as well as Bitcoin takes on an entirely new dimension.
Okay, amazing. So we're as one of the new leaders for it. Were you one of the people who conceptualized this event on Tuesday? Again, it's called Bitcoin for America,
Mhm.
where we'll be talking about how this current administration, generally speaking, the American government looks at Bitcoin and how they utilize it moving forward. So were you one of the people behind this?
Yeah, so at BPI, we're cooking it up, right? And we thought, this is a unique moment, right? We have our annual policy summit, which is our major event. We are going to putting on our major that next policy summit in June. And that's usually our biggest event of the year. We put a lot of effort into it. We really want to make that be kind of a marquee policy organizational activity in DC. We felt like we couldn't wait that long, right? There's a lot happening. This is a unique window in time. And sort of the historical opportunity is now, and so we thought this is the right moment to try to organize an event to sort of capitalize on the momentum here. So that's Bitcoin for America.
All right, interesting. So I'm assuming that this was initially planned without the knowledge that a crypto summit would be happening at the White House tomorrow. Am I right in assuming such a thing?
Yeah, no, it was a complete happenstance.
Okay.
Yeah, that just they happened to line up within a few days of each other. But no, no prior planning involved in that.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I imagine everyone at BPI's eyes are going to be on what happens tomorrow. So let's actually just start there, given that it is something that will obviously be addressed on Tuesday. What are you expecting to come out of the summit tomorrow, and how much of it do you think will revolve around or focus on Bitcoin?
I think, and I'm updating in real time. I think a lot has been in flux over the past few days, even around that event, and I know it's been the subject of rife speculation. I think the team at the White House has been doing yeoman's work to try to coordinate an enormous number of different stakeholders to put something like this on. Not only do they have to engage the industry participants, right, that are going to be there representing a wide range of different voices, but then you have the president's working group itself, which is a constellation of executive branch officials, all with their own important responsibilities. And then you have David Sachs and Bo Hines trying to wrangle all that together. So, as somebody who's trying to organize an event with not much notice to put on and draw a lot of significant voices to the table and to generate significant momentum, I have sympathy for what it takes to sort of spin all those different plates. But yeah, I am expecting now more explicit recognition of the distinction between Bitcoin and other digital assets.
Okay.
I'm expecting a much more explicit delineation of the logic around a strategic Bitcoin reserve and and U.S. government's relationship to Bitcoin and other digital assets. And I'm looking forward to seeing kind of what's the forward-looking stance. What tangibly is going to be executed. The executive order laid out a timeline, into July for the development of specific recommendations by the working group
Yep.
on things like stablecoins and the digital asset stockpile. I'm expecting, more to come, tomorrow that will move that particular ball forward. But I'm still unclear on the nature of the timeline, right? How much has actually been accelerated? How much has been pulled forward? And how does this concept of a crypto reserve interface or intersect with these other initiatives like a sovereign wealth fund? And so I think there's a lot of interesting ideas on the table. All the signs coming out more recently that I've heard are very positive. But this is DC, right? Things change, things evolve, and it's all about sort of making your voice heard.
Yeah, so things do change quite quickly. On Sunday, we had President Trump tweeting about this U.S. strategic crypto reserve. I'll accent on the word, or I'll highlight the word crypto there, not a strategic Bitcoin reserve necessarily. He initially announced that coins like, I think it was XRP, Sol, and ADA would be a part of it. The internet exploded, and all of a sudden he came back and said, of course, Bitcoin and Ethereum will be a part of this as well. Then we also heard from prominent voices in the industry, like Cameron, one of the Winklevoss twins, Naval Ravikant, even Brian from the CEO of Coinbase, speaking up, saying, I don't really think it makes much more, makes much sense to have anything other than Bitcoin in a strategic reserve. So, do you think that some of this messaging has gotten across to President Trump, and do you think he'll address this tomorrow at the summit?
Yes, I would agree that the industry reaction has been quite unanimous, right? Even from corners that maybe you wouldn't have expected in terms of the univocal recognition that only Bitcoin really can satisfy any reasonable criteria to be included as part of a national asset reserve, right? So this is an important barometer that is now being measured and is now, I think, hopefully going to be reflected in official government policy moves. Remains to be seen, like how that gets articulated, how the broader stance of the U.S. government and the federal government towards digital assets more generally gets defined, and sort of
Mm.
what distinctions are made, right? And I think this is part of the larger conversation that the executive order called for, right? Like how to define different sorts of use cases that recognize the distinct attributes of Bitcoin relative to other digital assets, while recognizing that there's a marketplace out there, and I don't think the government is in a position to pick winners or losers per se, but recognize that Bitcoin is unique, and if there is going to be something like a strategic Bitcoin reserve or strategic reserve of digital assets, Bitcoin is the only thing that makes sense to include.
Yeah, could we touch a little bit on that? I know we're doing this for Bitcoin Magazine. Of course, we have people here who understand that Bitcoin is unique, but maybe talk a little bit about this, especially given the fact that you've been such a proponent of the strategic Bitcoin reserve even before this announcement. The BPI in general has been a proponent of it. Just a quick overview of why Bitcoin is unique in this regard and why the United States might want to have some in a strategic reserve.
Yeah, so I think in the president's executive order explicitly called for the delineation of criteria that would be used to justify the inclusion or exclusion of any digital asset. So I think it's clear that if you were to write down those criteria, you would settle on a number of things that mark out Bitcoin as distinct, that are well known to Bitcoiners, right? The fact that there is no sort of central issuer, no one that has sort of a small group control over the nature of the protocol, the issuance schedule, and where there's no essentially insider crew that stands to gain disproportionately for the issuance or sale of the token, right? And that Bitcoin had kind of this immaculate conception. The issuance schedule was fixed from the beginning. Even Satoshi had to mine those initial coins. There was no privileged insiders associated with it, and that gives confidence in the supply cap. So this is an actual fixed hard asset that can function as digital gold, right? So if the function of a strategic reserve is to sort of complement our analog gold reserve with something like digital gold, then Bitcoin it functions as that digital gold synthetic commodity because of those unique properties. And I think those are recognized, and I think it's an important set of criteria that only Bitcoin can satisfy. Now, to the second question, which is why should the U.S. government hold Bitcoin at all? Why should it have a reserve of Bitcoin in particular? And this is a larger argument I think we've given in a few different 50-page white papers that BPI specializes in producing. But if I had to boil it down, it's in essence the government exists to provide essentially long-term strategic resilience to its population and to act on the popular welfare over the long term. And so no institution can provide for the common weal over the long term with a sense of generational resilience. And so individuals can acquire Bitcoin in their portfolios, companies can acquire it for their balance sheet and for their stockholders, investment funds can acquire it for their investors, but only the country can secure generational resilience on behalf of current and future generations. And so the country has to look around corners, has to think about disruptions to the legacy system that underpins its economic and national security, has to think about all possible ways that that system could be disrupted,
Yeah.
even ways that might not be, currently forecasted on the horizon. And so I think we are entering an age of digital disruption where technology acceleration, geopolitical competition, and geopolitical realignments expose the legacy geoeconomic monetary system to sources of disruption.
Yep.
And the U.S., being sort of the underwriter of that global security order and the provider of those global reserve assets, right, the Treasury market, is in a position of legacy strength, but also increasing strategic vulnerability. So the US government has to recognize that its plan A might be just to double down on the treasury market to ensure that it can continue to finance itself under all conditions, but it has to have plan B. And
Yep.
the US government, I used to ask and help answer these sorts of what if questions for the government, which is what if your plan A fails? What if there is a major geopolitical disruption, an attack, a major economic crisis? You have to have a plan that considers all these different downside scenarios, and I think it's prudent for the government to acquire a Bitcoin position as essentially a long-term hedge against future risks, right? And it can essentially acquire that option now for relatively low cost, and essentially get the jump on rivals that may seek to establish a position in Bitcoin before it. And so we're entering in an era where Bitcoin is a geopolitical asset. It's just at the sort of initial stages. Reserve managers are looking at it. Sovereign wealth funds are dabbling in it, but it's a nonlinear phenomenon, right? And so the U.S. government has to ask that what if question: What if Bitcoin were to monetize in an accelerated fashion to reach some meaningful fraction of gold, or even reach parity with gold, or
Right.
even surpass gold's value? And that would have significant geopolitical implications for U.S. power, depending on how that happens. If it
Yeah.
happens in a fashion where our rivals or other sources of power and capital in the world are acquiring Bitcoin and driving its monetization, well, if we don't have a material position, we might lose out on a relative basis. And so the US government has to think through those what ifs and has to make policy decisions now in the long-term interest of the common welfare, right? Not everyone can just self-insure by acquiring Bitcoin for themselves. Right now, we would hope that everyone could have the wherewithal. But as we look, right, most Americans don't own Bitcoin, right? And so, how can America, right, look out for all of its citizens now and into the future? I think acquiring a meaningful position in Bitcoin is essentially a moral obligation.
Understood. Appreciate that. Another thing that I'm sure the government is keeping in mind, and I'm sure this has to do with something of their apprehension of even adopting strategic reserve, of adopting or of creating this strategic reserve, is this idea that there are essentially two different ways to look at something like Bitcoin. You could say it's a competition to the dollar, or you could say it's something that's going to bolster the dollar, as Trump has been very vocal about. What is your opinion? Do you think the government is a little bit nervous about potentially propping up something just by buying it that could eventually compete with the dollar? Is this going through people in power's minds?
Yeah, I think it's a misnomer to think that Bitcoin is a threat to the dollar. If anything, Bitcoin is more of a threat to gold
Okay.
as a digital synthetic commodity that provides much more, I'd say, advanced properties when it comes to the sort of auditability, security, portability, and usefulness as a scarce reserve asset. In a digital, system that is increasingly fragmenting,
Yeah.
and so there, I think is more of a rival to gold in that sense, and highly complementary, on the other hand, with the US dollar treasury system. Right, there's a mechanical link between Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins that has
Mm,
been quite strong, and that mechanical link leads to an increased demand for U.S. Treasuries and an expansion of the dollar network. So I think this Bitcoin stablecoin synergy is quite strong and quite powerful, and reinforces our balance sheet on the one hand, but also spreads our values, right, to the extent that Bitcoin, we think, embodies American values of
right.
property rights, individual liberty, and autonomy, freedom from state censorship and coercion. And so, to the extent that we see Bitcoin win, not only do we see an increase in demand through the stablecoin market into our dollars, but we see the expansion of our values around the world, and those values are under assault in many places around the world by authoritarians who want to use digital tools and digital currencies as mechanisms of oppression and censorship. And so I think it's a win-win-win when it comes to Bitcoin and U.S. interests.
Okay. Appreciate that. So the SBR has gotten a lot of attention at the event on Tuesday. What other topics do you plan to talk about as they're pertinent to Bitcoin? Are you going to be talking about, I don't know, right to self custody, privacy, other things that Bitcoiners find very important that are maybe about sort of the personal rights associated with Bitcoin versus the way America is looking at Bitcoin or conceptualizing using Bitcoin?
Yes. So BPI's policy focus, and this is enduring throughout the year and years beyond, is really broken into, I'd say, four areas. First is sort of national security and geoeconomics. And that's basically the point I just made, like the alignment between Bitcoin and U.S. national security interests. The second is the intersection between Bitcoin and the energy system, right? So we're seeing this develop over several years, and I think now we're going to see a proliferation of different business models and use cases, everything from open source mining, home mining, to integration with AI, high performance data centers, controllable load, et cetera, and demand response programs. So there's a whole field of sort of policy analysis in regards to Bitcoin as a novel sort of energy sort of demand a resource.
Yep.
There is the third is sort of Bitcoin on the global scale, like Bitcoin as a tool that can be used by anyone, cross border permissionless payment system, and then as a rail upon which other sorts of technologies can be built. Right, different sorts of stable coins, different sorts of assets, different sorts of decentralized finance applications. And then the fourth is like more our values, right? How do we think about this ethos that Bitcoin represents? It's an ethos of the individual, but recognizing a global project. And this is an important dimension upon which the relationship between the state and the individual as society kind of enters into an accelerating digital age. Bitcoin, I think, represents potential counterbalance to centralized, oligarchic, or oligopolistic technology control models that can be used as instruments of state coercion.
Mm.
And so I think we want to address all of this, right? Bitcoin is this not one simple thing with one simple set of policies. It's a fulcrum point or a prism through which lots of other sort of policy issues that are among the most important in our current era. So we're going to be addressing all of those over the course of the year. The event next Tuesday, obviously, we can't touch on all of that, right?
Yeah.
It is it's a few hours, and we want to bring together key participants, key players representing the digital assets industry, thought leaders, executives, folks from traditional finance, folks that are now sort of getting into the sort of Bitcoin world, but are coming from maybe a more traditional background, folks from kind of the traditional policy ecosystem inside DC, right? The think tanks, the government agencies, folks that have a particular a view on one of those questions, whether it's illicit finance, whether it's sort of energy, whether it's civil liberties, and sort of bring them all into a room and really start to catalyze, right? It's like kind of you reach critical mass, right? Get a number of people representing all these different disciplines, all these different perspectives, and then bring the politicians in, right?
Yeah.
The senators, the congressmen, and then representatives from the White House, and demonstrate, one, why Bitcoin is strategically important, right, to the United States along all these different dimensions that we examined, why it's a really serious topic to be examined through all these different lenses,
Yep.
and then make the case for why it's important for the United States to acquire Bitcoin, as I just mentioned. And then third, more get into like the practicalities of like, how should we do it, right? With the last 4 years, Bitcoin and Bitcoiners were more on the defensive.
Yep.
Now that we're in this position where we can potentially drive positive policy, well, what and how, right?
Yep.
And tactically, what does that look like? What can be done now and over the next few years to move the ball forward on all these different dimensions? And so we want to try to get to brass tacks and also develop key relationships where folks that are inside the Bitcoin community and outside the Bitcoin community can talk to each other and can engage on the details, engage on the substance, and get to solutions that work for everybody.
revolution. Never sell your Bitcoin.
Amazing. And I know Senator Lummis is going to be at the event. I think she's a bit of like the guest of honor at the event. Can you give us a preview of some other people who will be there, or is that sort of under wraps for the time being?
So we're expecting to have multiple senators
Okay.
there. We're expecting to have multiple congressmen representing both sides of the aisle, give announcements, important announcements related to the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve that will hopefully advance that piece of legislation forward, demonstrate building momentum behind that type of legislation, and sort of hopefully kind of catalyze more action on that front.
Okay.
So I think there'll be some important announcements to come, some new voices, hopefully that will go on stage and articulate why they think Bitcoin is a good thing for America, and then have some really interesting fireside chats and panel discussions from folks from the industry and folks from without the industry. Again, to have like a different type of conversation, right? I think we're going to solve all the problems or resolve all these issues all in one go. But
On Tuesday.
I see it as a starting gun, right? To say let's bring
Yeah.
everyone together that has a stake here, and that DC is fundamentally in a different place and going in a different direction. And
Okay.
how do we ensure that's informed by good Bitcoin understanding and good policy?
Okay, excellent. Very cool. I'm excited for it. Another thing, so the SBR is obviously the hot topic with Bitcoin right now, but there are going to be other topics that come up related to privacy, being able to use Bitcoin permissionlessly. This was discussed a little bit in the first subcommittee hearing on digital assets, which happened, I think it was just about a week ago. They, former CFTC chair Tim Mossad was present, who I think is the person who classified, or under his watch at the CFTC, Bitcoin was classified as a commodity. There was a lot of talk of stable coins at that conference or at that committee hearing. And there was also Tim, former chair Mossad brought up a lot of issues around potentially illicit finance, privacy, the fact that something like Bitcoin or stable coins are bearer assets. How do we sort of find a balance between these things? Can you give any sort of preview on what sorts of discussions you've had around this technology, obviously, that people can use permissionlessly with the need to obviously counterbalance that it will be used in some cases for illicit finance, and we do need to have some sort of plan in place to combat that. What does that look like in your mind based on the conversations you may have had already?
Yes, and the way I think about it, there are sort of three core aspects of Bitcoin that are very different in terms of how they interface with government policy in different ways, right?
Yeah.
So Bitcoin, the asset, right, is regulated as a commodity. It's treated, as a financial instrument that's properly regulated by the CFTC. That's been well established. Property, per the IRS. That's kind of relatively, anchored, right, as Bitcoin, the asset. There's Bitcoin, the network, right, which has this interface with, say, the energy system, as we talked about, but also it's a cross-border network, right? So that is how it gets implicated in things like OFAC and FinCEN and the
Right.
intelligence community. How we think about who's using Bitcoin, good guys, quote unquote, and bad guys around the world, right? And where does that interface with our on ramps and off ramps in different jurisdictions? And the balance between security and privacy, right? National
Yeah.
security and civil liberties. And that's where then the third part of Bitcoin comes in, which is the users, the community here. Like Bitcoin is this technology, it's a piece of software, it runs on computers around the world, but ultimately it's humans that use it, that want to use it for certain purposes. And
Yeah.
in democracy, right? Like we have certain expectations of a space of autonomy and freedom
Yeah.
to ourselves, and we would want those to be respected around the world as well. And so we see Bitcoin not just as this technical project, but as a potential as a as an ethic that is driving to expand the domain, like win a new territory for human freedom, right?
Yeah.
As Satoshi said. And so the conversations, I'd say, in DC are evolving on that subject. Obviously the SBR is very much weighted on the asset side, right? Is
Yes.
thinking about Bitcoin as digital gold. And that's a very important, very critical feature of Bitcoin, but it's not the only critical and important feature of Bitcoin, right? And the equally important feature of Bitcoin is as a global, permissionless, censorship resistant, a payment and
Network.
settlement system.
Right.
and we want to ensure that we don't just get the SBR and then the heavy hand of the state comes down on open source developers and the ability for people to permissionlessly use Bitcoin, right? And so that is a policy focus of ours. I think it's an evolving subject because I think there are certain legacy folks inside those intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies that never quite could accommodate themselves to such a thing, right?
Okay.
And it just generated a lot of friction, right? And a lot of cases, a lot of lawsuits, a lot of I think unjustified assaults on individual liberties along the way. And so I think we're reaching a recognition where that stance isn't productive and it actually is self-defeating, right? Because you can't stop Bitcoin, right? So the question is, how can you balance, right? It's a matter of balance.
Right.
And I think now we can try to push very far in terms of making sure that there is a large domain, right? And I think this is what the executive order even said, like developing open source software shouldn't be a crime, right? Developing permissionless systems that just run as code, right? Those are not brokers, right? Like these are just new aspects of our society that can exist because of technology, and the law needs to catch up with that,
Yeah.
right? Trying to force those technologies to meet 20th or even 19th century definitions is just going to lead to bad law that's ineffective and doesn't actually lead to good outcomes. So I think we need a kind of a bottom up rethinking of how national security interests can really be still met while recognizing that the basic technological paradigm is changing,
Yep.
right? And there's gonna be an adaptation that needs to happen on that side of the ledger, and I think that adaptation is underway. And I think
Yep.
there's also places where new technology can come in to help with that, right? So you can do things with zero knowledge proofs that can provide measure of sort of accountability in some sense without unmasking individual identities, right?
Okay.
Without revealing without sort of undermining sort of fundamental privacy rights. And so I think this is going to be I think an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
And I think to the extent that the United States adopts a pro Bitcoin policy stance, at least from my perspective, PPI's perspective, that means adopting a pro Bitcoin, not just the asset, but pro Bitcoin, the network
The
stance.
network, right?
And where we fundamentally think open cross border systems are aligned with our values and our interests, directly opposed to the closed authoritarian systems of our rivals.
Yeah. I
Just like with the open internet, just with things like Tor, yes, there's going to be bad people that use these things to do bad things, but that doesn't mean the thing is a bad thing, right? Like Tor is a useful tool for human rights, right? The internet was fundamentally an open system that leveraged our democracy and our open society to catapult us to leadership in that new technology. I think we need to adopt the same attitude with Bitcoin.
appreciate that. Great parallel. Something that you've said in some of your talks, you've talked about how policy is nonlinear. And so it seems like maybe nothing's happening and then all of a sudden something happens. We could almost, I don't know, think about it like Bitcoin's price, so kind of like a gradually then suddenly thing. Like it sort of chops along and then all of a sudden something happens. So, what are potential trajectories in your mind? How quickly can stuff get accomplished? Can certain policy be put into action? How long might it take? What are sort of maybe some of the pathways that you envision?
Yeah, so the quickest thing that would be quite nonlinear would be for the president to sign an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. BPI, we drafted kind of a notional version of such an executive order that lays out like a clear sort of legal case and an operational implementation that would just require like some diligent review by lawyers and experts at Treasury Department and some White House, counsel to get the president to sign it. And that, would not be like the end all be all, but would potentially leverage existing authorities and funds in the Exchange Civilization Fund as authorized by the Gold Reserve Act, and that could be like a 0 to 1 thing, right? Where all of a sudden, if everyone on that side agrees this is a good idea, they could execute it, they can implement it. It could be done relatively quickly.
Okay.
That would be perishable though, right? Like all executive orders are.
Right.
And so this is where the real catalyst would come from legislation action.
Yes.
So we're seeing things on that front that are encouraging, and that's where you do get to this sort of non-linearity, right? Where you had Senator Lummis really be the lone voice out there pushing her Bitcoin Act, and I think that may change next week, and that can generate momentum, especially if the president also supports it. And so look for potential movements on that front. I think this is politics in DC is essentially a one-on-one process, right? Individual senators have to have meetings with their colleagues. Staff to staff level conversations have to happen. They have to understand it. They have to feel comfortable with it. It has to resonate with their worldviews, with their policy priorities, with their needs to represent their constituencies.
Mm,
And this was a relatively new idea, right? It was announced in Nashville. I think the legacy sort of policy priorities in the crypto world, were focused on stablecoins and market
right.
structure,
Hmm.
and they still are. Certainly, I think those are still very much priorities to get across the finish line this Congress. And I think this SBR concept kind of came in very quickly from left field and is now kind of trying to muscle in on and get political attention.
Yep.
And I think that was a very nonlinear thing. Like 6 months ago, this concept of an SBR was very much like a, you know, like on the whiteboard, right? As like
Right.
an idea, maybe, right? Could that happen? And now it's a very serious policy issue. We could see high level statements come out from the White House, and that could catalyze momentum across Congress. Again, nothing is a done deal, but I think you could see things start to snowball. The other thing that's quite nonlinear is just the geopolitical reaction, right? Um, the president's words have weight, and these moves could trigger responses by other countries and other national leaders that potentially can go quicker than our democratic process can. Right? These
Right.
kings and crown princes and national leaders can decide to move lots of capital if they feel like this is now a new regime and they need to move their countries in a different direction. And so all of those changes could be precipitated by not much. And that's why this next 6-12 months I think will be very critical to the future of Bitcoin in America, right? Very positive signs, very positive momentum, but the aperture of possibility and therefore uncertainty is very wide, right? And so I think BPI, we exist, at this particular moment to try to steer towards the most optimal high impact outcomes along that distribution of possibilities. But nothing's guaranteed, and there's a lot that's contingent and a lot that's path dependent. And I want to make sure that at least the United States is putting itself and its future citizens in the best possible position.
Appreciate that. Just quickly go back to one of the words you used there. You said an executive order is perishable. Just to clarify for the listeners, so what you mean there is essentially that the next person who comes into power, the next president, can overturn that executive order, potentially leading to what, even a market sell of the Bitcoin that the U.S. government holds. What could that be a potential outcome if it never actually gets put into or gets put through legislation, and if it's just an executive order?
Yeah, exactly. If Bitcoin holdings or acquisitions are anchored only by executive order, then a future White House could reverse it, and
Right.
even a current White House could reverse it, right? If they decide that for whatever reasons they want to change their policy. Whereas if you have it in law, it's a congressional program, it's a congressional requirement, it's authorized by statute, and that's I mean, people can break the law, but it's much harder to.
Yeah.
So that would be a much more enduring basis to shift U.S. government's relationship to Bitcoin, over the long term.
Okay, amazing. And just to make sure I was sort of interpreting what you said correctly, so you could also start with an EO, which might be a good thing in that if we do see sort of game theory play out, if you will, in other countries, hear the president talk about establishing the SBR, and then they start buying in mass as well. Starting with the EO might be a good thing. Legislating after that might be the way to go, just so we're not so we're not. For lack of a better term, front run to buying the Bitcoin en masse for the state. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, like once the commander in chief and the national leadership in Congress have decided this is a good thing to do, then the most prudent thing is to establish like a starter position to get the
Right.
mechanisms in place. And importantly, not just you say the surplus funds and the exchange stabilization fund, but also conduct a audit and then collect all the digital assets currently held by the federal government, which I believe are much larger than are what's currently inventoried, at least on paper by U.S. Marshal Service. I think there's a
Right.
lot of Bitcoin floating around out there. And I think so. First order of business is for the president to order a full accounting of all of those assets and to
Yep.
consolidate those existing assets into one location. I think that is like that has to happen immediately, in my opinion. And that is a phase one, and then phase two is to think about how you can acquire more using Exchange Stabilization Fund, and then phase three is obviously try to trigger that, use that as catalyst and political momentum to get this across in Congress on a bipartisan basis, right? I think there are folks across the aisle that recognize the alignment between Bitcoin and their own sort of political and strategic interests, and so it's not impossible, but you have to push that forward, right? You have to get momentum behind it. You have to get people a sense that this is a matter of urgency. And so I think that's what the summit tomorrow and what our event on Tuesday is about, and a lot of other future work that we're going to be pushing is about, without losing sight of like, these other critical features of Bitcoin. Right? It isn't just
Yep.
about U.S. government buying Bitcoin. Like this is about making sure that this is not just good for Bitcoin, but good for America, right? And that we want to see open systems flourish around the world. We want to see the ability to access and use these tools supported and not constrained. And I
Yeah.
think the best way to get to that outcome is when the US thinks it's a good thing to do, right? They're acting as a tailwind and not a headwind for global adoption.
Okay, appreciate that. Speaking of the U.S. Marshals, who you just brought up, I think it was David Bailey who put a $10,000 bounty out there for someone to figure out who's holding what keys to what digital assets over there. Have you heard anything? So I think it was CoinDesk that published a piece. It was maybe between 10 and 14 days ago at this point, that sort of illustrated that the U.S. Marshals don't tend to know how many digital assets they have, which ones they have, which versions of them that they have some of them forked, do they have the forked versions, etc. Have you heard anything about an update on this? Are people gathering the keys to these assets, coming up with some sort of legitimate list that we can sort of measure up against when it comes to putting together either a strategic Bitcoin reserve, or if it ends up being a US strategic crypto reserve, something like that as well, if we're at least going to start with what we're just holding now and turning that into the reserve?
I haven't heard any reaction or any movement in response to that article, which was very concerning to me.
Yes,
As a taxpayer, as a citizen, I don't like to see my government sort of act irresponsibly in the possession and management of billions of dollars of my assets.
totally.
Like you want, like, forget Bitcoin, whether it was Ferraris or whatever, like
Whatever.
whatever you got that you've held in those seizures, like this should be properly managed and accounted. And so that
Yeah,
was quite a shocking story. And I hope it triggers, intense scrutiny. It's kind of funny or ironic in the era of Doge and, yeah, Elon's folks running around. I'm like, the Doge folks should like take a look at this, right? Like, where is America's Bitcoin? Who has control of it? How is it properly, custodied and secured? I mean, that's not an insignificant sum of funds. It seems quite irresponsible for a government agency just to kind of throw this into a spreadsheet.
totally.
So yeah, quite concerning to me. I don't have any inside information about the response to that, or maybe it's, who knows, maybe it's misreported. I don't know, but
Okay.
on the face of it, it's very concerning. And I hope the incoming leadership at these agencies, which are, to be honest, like they just recently got their spots right.
Right.
And there's lots of other geopolitical and geoeconomic things happening that this may not be the top priority, but
Right.
I think it should be addressed imminently. But yeah, and I think the president could just say like, hey, where is America's Bitcoin? You say 200,000, but that's just like a number. I don't actually know if we can point to anything very 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 reliably and say, yes, like, okay, these are the UTXOs and this is who holds them. This is the custody arrangement. This is the
Right.
security arrangement. This is the audit, yada, yada, yada. Like, we're sort of going off of, somewhat, I don't know, weak information. And that story, was concerning to me.
Well, I was surely hoping for a more comforting response than that, but I appreciate the honesty, so
Like,
thank
we'll
you.
take each one, and hopefully, we're gonna bring it up, on next Tuesday, and hopefully someone brings it up in the summit tomorrow, right?
Okay.
We're gonna talk about, uh, Bitcoin reserve or even a crypto reserve of some kind. It's like, hey guys, like, step one is just to like get control of the things you already have,
Totally.
and that seems to be like a no brainer. I think everyone should agree with that, right? Like, you could be completely against the SBR, but like want to ensure that we have effective governance and accountability of our assets.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, You make a number of good points. Everything you're saying here resonates deeply with me. It seems that you obviously care about Bitcoin, all dimensions of it, the network, the asset, and you care about America. I think you're a great person to be talking with people in our government about the importance of both and maybe how one can bolster the other. Um, I think oftentimes, though, people think about the government and those who work for it, work in it as a monolith, something that's very difficult to sort of make change in or within. Could you give any sort of insight into maybe some of the conversations you're having, maybe outside of someone like Senator Lummis, who we know is a proponent? What has the educational process been like, and what sorts of successes have you had in trying to educate people in government about the importance of Bitcoin?
Yes, and obviously I've been, on the periphery of BPI for a number of years, and now I'm jumping in. I see up close, but I've seen an evolution of these conversations, right? Which tends to wax and wane with the market value, right? And then obviously
Right.
with the exogenous events like FTX. So the crypto industry, I would say more generally, like has had a very fraught kind of reputation inside DC over the last few years.
Yeah.
Where a lot of folks were burned, a lot of folks were sort of turned off by it, and then tuned out, right? And then now there's a lot more folks now tuning back in, and but with a much more positive valence, right? Both from the Republican side, where it's now clear that being pro Bitcoin and pro crypto is a core plank of the Republican Party, but
Right.
also on the Democratic side, I think there's a large fraction of that party that recognizes that the sort of anti-crypto stance, the sort of Elizabeth Warren anti-crypto army, was not helpful, to
Yeah.
them. And so I think there's a reconfiguration, a recalibration by at least some members of that party, to try to figure out how they can, demonstrate their pro Bitcoin bona fides while also kind of maintaining a partisan distance from the White House. Right, this
Yeah.
is a difficult balancing act. Right, how to be pro Bitcoin but also not just kind of you know de facto support everything Trump's gonna trying to do. But I think that creates overlap where there can be bipartisan compromise and bipartisan agreement. And I think we're seeing this dramatically shift in terms of the interest level, right? Just for example, the request by offices to be like, hey, like, do you have a Bitcoin or crypto person that I can hire as a staffer, right? Because
Wow.
there's a recognition that they need to get smart, and these folks have to balance lots of different policy issues in their portfolio, and they recognize, okay, I don't actually have somebody on my staff that can really handle this for me, and so
Yeah.
there's now a rising demand for just policy expertise, right? And BPI can only provide some of it, right? Like we're growing dramatically, but we're still pretty much bandwidth constrained at the moment. Like we can't meet the demand that we're already seeing come in from these different offices with these different requests.
Yeah.
We're acting as a kind of a coordinator to try to share expertise across offices, try to facilitate meetings. There's now, like, I think like a hockey stick inflection point of just the level of interest, where some senior senators, right, were just, they haven't really paid much attention to
Yeah.
this at all, right? So they're kind of
Yeah.
asking the basics, right? So we're at this interesting moment where at the same time, there's going to be the summit, national leadership coming out, basically potentially pushing in a direction of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and then you have senior senators, some even on relevant committees, trying to, like, get their arms around what the strategic implications of this are. And then there's lots of other staff across the Congress that are also trying to get smart, like, all at the same time. And so I think
Okay.
we're seeing this tidal wave start to build, which is very positive in one sense, a lot of opportunity, but it means that, like, the time is ripe for, like, good solid education, right? And as you can see in these different, the DC policy ecosystem is a mixed bag, I would say.
Yeah.
Right, we saw the announcement from Ripple of a national cryptocurrency association, kind of a sort of astroturf organization
Yeah.
that has like tens of millions of dollars in its war
Yeah.
chest, right? That is tens times the size of BPI, right? And so it's kind of this situation where Bitcoin specific policy is vastly overshadowed by lots of other different activities, right? So there's a lot of noise and the
Yeah. Yeah.
signals potentially not as amplified. So ideally we get to a spot where, like, Bitcoin policy is sort of at least market weight, right, inside
Mm.
the and I think it's vastly under market weight, and that's maybe why you get those sorts of Sunday tweets too, as an example, and then it takes work to kind of steer things back. in a more of a Bitcoin focused direction, while recognizing that this is a diverse ecosystem, and it's
Right.
a matter of making sure Bitcoin is represented in proportion to its importance and its uniqueness. Which is
Yeah.
right now that's not the case, right? It's the almost the inverse of what you would expect.
That's what I was going to say. So, and all, I was at the first press conference that David Sachs hosted. It was a press conference on digital assets and the subcommittee for digital assets. And it seems, for someone who doesn't understand the technology that well, the waters are quite muddy. That all digital assets are similar in some ways, and that Bitcoin just is just one of the other digital assets. This idea of market weighting it, or it being differentiated or different from the other ones, just doesn't, from what I'm understanding, what I gather, it just doesn't seem to be a framework that most people have in their minds. Do you think maybe 6 months from now, a year from now, do you foresee a world where people start at least using phrases like Bitcoin and crypto? Are we getting there? Are we moving in that direction, or are the waters still quite muddy right now?
I think we are, and I think even if you look at the statements from folks that are fundamentally, I think, like multi-coin in their orientation, right?
Yeah.
Major exchanges, major investment funds, e- even folks whose bags would be heavily, pumped if it was a sole reserve. I
Right.
think even those folks are like, listen, it's very clear. Bitcoin is the only thing that belongs in a in a strategic reserve. Like, it's just these are very different things fundamentally, and there's different criteria that only Bitcoin can meet to get into that reserve. And so I think there is a recognition on that front. I think it's just up until now, really, it hasn't had that. We haven't had that forcing function to bring those latent opinions into the fore, to have those
Right.
be articulated so explicitly. In fact, one of the original rationales for coming up with something like Bitcoin for America was to try to provide that locus point where we can
Mm,
bring folks from across not just Bitcoin industry, but the digital assets industry more generally, folks that run these big exchanges, and have them all basically say, kind of in one voice, yeah, Bitcoin is special. It's not the only thing, but
mm.
Bitcoin is special, and Bitcoin is the only thing that belongs in a strategic Bitcoin in a strategic reserve, and that merits a strategic level of attention by the United States. Yes,
Yeah.
there needs to be a common framework, get market structure, make sure that stablecoins can flourish with fair regulation. But we wanted to make sure that there was this opportunity, this sort of Bitcoin focused opportunity,
Yeah.
that we would bring folks that maybe would not traditionally expect to sort of amplify, that signal, right? I think that signal needs to be amplified. So I think we're going in that direction. And yeah, I don't know, like the terminology might evolve, but I think we're starting to see this now. Start to separate out.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I think there is a lot of power in not only these people speaking up on their own, the Winklevoss twins, other people who are multi-coiners or pro crypto more broadly, speaking up on their own, but you're bringing them together to speak up in the same room together. I think that will be an extremely powerful thing for people to witness, and hopefully something that catalyzes change. With a lot of people, when they learn about Bitcoin, they sort of, they never see the world the same again. They sort of understand this new element that we have in the world, this new dimension of money, of a network, and things change for them. And I think we've even seen the same with politicians. Certain politicians, are seem to be legitimate Bitcoiners. When it comes to the educational process, do you see legitimate aha moments like, oh, that's what's going on here? And is it just that most people haven't had those moments yet? So oftentimes what we're maybe attributing to malice is just simply a lack of understanding. Like, I say we, as in the Bitcoin community,
Mhm.
saying, oh, these politicians are against us, this, that. Maybe not. Maybe they just haven't had that eye-opening moment. Do you feel like that might be what's actually happening here versus more, we're going to do everything in our power to stop this?
Yeah, I would say there's like two examples, and I can't give their specific names, but one is an example of a congressman that I know is extremely pro Bitcoin,
Okay.
right? That would not be, but is not was not known to me as being pro Bitcoin before,
Okay.
right? That they had their own policy priorities representing their constituencies. They just happened to be a Bitcoiner, right? And so
Mm.
it was like until the permission structure or the political environment, went in a direction where they could sort of act on that personal belief. It just didn't have much
Uh,
like political salience or political relevance, and now
mm.
and so now they can figure out how to, put themselves in a position to turn their personal beliefs into sort of a public stance and then drive that, right? And so there's sort of, maybe the dark matter of Bitcoiners, right, out there, but there's
Yeah.
reflected in legislation or co-sponsorships or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think now that you see this larger to more like environmental change, right? Where like there's just the weather is different, right? And
Yeah.
so that permission structure is fundamentally different, and that a lot of folks that maybe have these latent views can sort of take that next
Mm,
and then
yeah.
there's the folks that, come at, that have a really hard national security or intelligence background. They sit on those relevant committees, and they've been in Congress for years and years, and they've just been getting briefing after briefing after briefing of Hamas using X, Y, and Z, and China using it, and hackers using this, and so just the overall, information diet where Bitcoin or crypto is at all relevant is all associated with bad guys doing bad things.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so you have to kind of come to them and just show them like a whole different set of information that just haven't been exposed to really, right? And you just sort of shift their mindset and sort of broaden how they think about this thing and show them that their concerns, while significant and merited, are overbalanced by these other very much more positive things, right? And so I think there's a lot of folks like that that are, it's just they haven't, they're balancing. We live and breathe Bitcoin all the time, right? And Bitcoiners, it occupies a disproportionate share of our time and attention. The average politician, the average staffer, it is a tiny fraction, right? And so
Yes.
depending on which committee you're on, or where you sit, like even that tiny fraction could be weighted to the downside in terms of a negative disposition.
Yep.
Um, but on the other hand, tells me it's that's not impossible to change. Like those attitudes, they're not hard. A lot of them aren't truly hard baked, right? Some of them are, right? Obviously, people that rhetorically have backed themselves into a certain corner, like Elizabeth Warren,
Yeah. Right.
those folks again. But I think that's relatively a minority, right? I
Okay.
think most of these other folks haven't really formed very strong opinions, right? And they're open to be convinced. And I think you can actually change people's minds. Pretty like Bitcoin is this interesting phenomenon where it's not um it's still a lot of folks haven't yet settled out their views, or their views are just kind of they're kind of the default views,
Right.
whatever their
Right.
party or whatever their sort of milieu is. But if you actually engage them, you really bring arguments to the table that resonate with their interest or their concerns, they're open. And I've seen that, firsthand. So that's bullish for BPI. At least that's our whole reason for existence, is the
Yeah.
premise that that's true. So I'm talking my book to a certain extent. But I think it's borne out in practice, and I think not everyone's gonna flip, right? Not everyone could be orange pilled, as quickly as some others. But I think there's the low hanging fruit by all means has not been plucked.
Okay, interesting. That's great to hear. I'm going to land the plane here just quickly to let to everyone listening know that we will be streaming this meeting that they're having, or
Mhm,
the Bitcoin for America event that
mhm.
Bitcoin Policy Institute is hosting. So we'll be streaming that. So please tune in. Matt, just wanted to, any final thoughts here? Anything that people should watch out for in the conference? Any maybe sort of I don't know, little heads up on what people should be kind of paying attention to moving forward from here.
Yeah, so we're really excited that Bitcoin Magazine will be live streaming it. It's also going to be live streamed on Rumble, and
Cool.
the Rumble CEO will be a speaker. And then we're going to have, hopefully, a lot more energy coming out of this event on our future programs. And so this is an invite only, relatively small group, maybe 150, 200 attendees. Our Bitcoin Policy Summit, which is scheduled. For the latter part of June. Check that out, I think June 25th. That is also invitational, but we're going to expand that to at least 700, maybe even 1,000 attendees. So if you weren't able to get into this particular event, this was very small. Unfortunately, we couldn't accommodate everyone that requested invite. The Bitcoin Policy Summit, we would love to have you there. And then more generally, we are always looking for smart Bitcoiners who want to engage in policy, whether that's informally, you just want to like support our work, where you want to retweet us on X, or whether you want to engage with us as a fellow of some kind. You have a professional expertise, whether it's in energy or human rights or national security. We're always on the lookout for really smart Bitcoiners who want to engage seriously in the hard work of policy. And yeah, so support our work and be on the lookout. I think we're going to be do some really interesting things this year. Oh, well, one other shout out. Really excited to be doing a partnership with Hubkey. So we're going to be opening up
Woo.
a physical office downtown in DC. Opening date, full operating capability is sort of TBD, but sometime over the summer, we'll have essentially a Bitcoin embassy established in the heart of DC. where we'll be able to do full sort of programming events, bring DC to Bitcoin and Bitcoin to DC, and sort of plant the flag in the nation's capital there. So once that's up and running, it would be a great spot for Bitcoiners if they're coming to DC to drop by and hang out. So really excited. Good vibes, right? Sort of all around. I think the vibes are really positive, and yeah, I really appreciate everyone's support and reach out if you want to get involved.
Amazing. So yeah, I get plenty of emails and DMs from people saying, "How can I get more involved?" You just heard what Matt said there. Please, act on that. Matt, thank you so much for your time here. Thank you for the work that you do with BPI. Thank you for having the conversations that you do with stakeholders, with people in government. It's all really important. We sincerely appreciate it. We're very much looking forward to Tuesday. I know I'll be there in person, and we're looking forward to streaming it. Thank you for your time today, and we will talk soon.